Beans, 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 Boston baked beans, beans. Boston beans? Beantown? Who calls it Beantown? The answer is nobody from Beantown calls it Beantown. I'm Dr. Vitka from Dr. Vitka's Myths, Legends, and Lore. Why in the world is Boston called Beantown? I grew up around here, and I'd never heard it called Beantown until I was at least a teenager. And then it was from somebody on TV saying Beantown. Nobody around here uses that term. So where did it come from? That's what we're going to find out today. About Boston foods, what do you think about? Lobsters? Steamed clams? Maybe Hoodsy Cup ice cream with a weird little wooden spoon. Those are Boston foods. But not beans. Beans are for hobos and cowboys. Beans are the food that makes you fart in cartoons. They're not a Boston thing. Are they? So how in the world did Boston come to be known as Beantown? Well, the answer, like everything around here, is it's the fault of the Puritans and the Kennedys. When the first English settlers arrived in the New World, they were starving. The food they'd brought on their long voyages had all been eaten up. They weren't used to farming the harsh, rocky New England soil. They were going to die if they didn't get something to eat. Thankfully for them, but unlucky for the indigenous people, some local tribes took pity on these European colonizers and showed them how to eat native style. They taught them about corn and showed them how to bake beans. They survived those first long, cold winters eating baked Boston beans. But even once beans were no longer just a sustenance food, they were still a very important part of Boston culture. You see, those first colonizers were the Pilgrims, and later the Puritans, crazy Christian sects, and one of their biggest rules was they had to adhere to the Sabbath. Sunday was a day set aside for prayer and reflection in church. You weren't allowed to work or play on Sunday. You weren't allowed to do anything but get down on your knees in church. Cooking was prohibited, but they still wanted a hot meal on Sunday. So what were they going to do? They were going to eat beans. Starting on Saturday, the Puritans would prepare great big bubbling cauldrons of beans. They'd bake them for hours, and then as night fell, they'd stuff the bean pots into their ovens and let them simmer all night long. When the morning came, the beans would still be piping hot, so they had stuff to eat on those cold, prayerful Sundays. And thus was born the great tradition of the Sunday bean supper. Eventually, visitors from less religiously inclined areas started to visit Boston. They noticed the curious custom of eating copious piles of beans every Sunday, and they wrote to their friends about it. They started calling Boston Beantown. It was humorous, it was a little derisive, it wasn't untrue, but the Beantown name has come to haunt Boston for generations. The Puritan stranglehold on Boston eventually waned. But beans were still in vogue. Tradition dies hard around here, and even today you can find people who'll eat Boston beans every Sunday. In fact, Up until recently, there was a diner I would go to where every Sunday their special was Boston beans. Beans were always popular, but the Beantown name started fading into the background. There were resurgences. For example, in 1890, there was a Civil War veterans reunion held in Boston, and one of the souvenirs given to them were commemorative bean pots. And right when baseball took off as a national pastime, what do you think they named the Boston team? That's right, the Boston Bean Eaters. They could have just named them the Boston Fart Bombs. The Bean Eaters is a terrible name. Eventually, the team didn't want to be the Bean Eaters anymore, so they escaped to Atlanta and became the Atlanta Braves. From Bean Eaters to Braves. Beans were still popular, but the Beantown name became a relic of the past. A quaint bit of local lore. Nobody was calling Boston Beantown anymore, thank goodness. Nobody was going to call it Beantown ever again until John F. Kennedy Jr.'s grandfather came on the scene. John F. Fitzgerald, John F. Kennedy Jr.'s grandfather. They called him Honey Fitz because he was so smooth and sweet. Honey Fitz sounds like a type of bean dish, doesn't it? He was the mayor of Boston, and he was a popular man-of-the-people type politician. He took bribes, but he also created jobs and was very popular in Boston. In an attempt to boost Boston tourism and to rally civic pride, Honey Fitz latched on to the Old Home Week phenomena. Old Home Week was an event that was taking the nation by storm. In the years following the Civil War and after the Industrial Revolution, people were displaced and they longed for the comforts of their old hometowns. Old Home Week, celebrated in places all across New England, was to be a celebration of the old days, nostalgia for the past. Imagine a high school reunion, but for the whole town. People were supposed to come back and share stories of the good old days. And Honey Fitz thought this would be a great way to bring people to Boston. To promote the 1907 edition of Boston Old Home Week, Honey Fitz resurrected the Boston bean. Leaning into the bean tradition, he had millions of stickers and postcards printed out with illustrations of a Boston bean pot and the slogan, "You don't know beans until you've been to Boston." At that time, postcards were an incredibly popular way of keeping in touch. They only cost a penny to mail, and hundreds and thousands of people from all around the world got postcards from Boston advertising the Boston bean. Didn't matter if you'd never even been to Boston. If you got a postcard with a bean on it, you'd know it was coming from Boston. Even at the time, some local historians despised the "you don't know beans unless you've been to Boston" campaign. They said that beans were a dumb symbol of Boston. They were a sign of hard times, a sustenance food from the bad old days. They thought, wouldn't it make more sense to represent Boston with a picture of a Revolutionary War guy or one of our modern buildings? Maybe a Native American, or a lobster. There were so many things that were more Boston than beans. But by then, the damage was done. People all over the world had gotten the message that Boston was Beantown. For better or worse, beans were part of our cultural identity. The beans could not be put back in the can. The damage was done. People all around the country and all around the globe were calling Boston Beantown. It got so bad that in the 1930s, Warner Brothers Studios, the cartoon people behind Looney Tunes, even introduced a character called Beans. He was an anthropomorphic cat, and when he announced himself on the screen, he'd pop up and say, "I'm Beans of the Boston Beans." Today, that might seem puzzling, but in 1936, apparently, people got the joke, and Beans, for a while, was right up there with Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny. Boston was all about the beans. And this tradition continued. Even in the 1980s, there was a comedy on network TV called Good Night, Beantown. And that's what I'm going to say to you now. Good night, Beantown. So what do you think? Should Boston be called Beantown? Is it truly a dumb name? Or do you think it honors those brave bean eaters of the past? What do you suggest calling it? Let me know in the comments.